Okay, AP Environmental Science. This is topic 5.3 in Unit 5. If you haven't really noticed, we've been kind of skipping around a lot in this unit, and we're going to do that because there's a lot of topics that are kind of not really packaged, I don't think, at least in a very good order. So we kind of skip around a little bit in this unit, but don't worry so much about that. All right, this particular topic. There's a few different parts to this that I'm gonna probably spend a few days on when it comes to topic 5.3. It involves something called the Green Revolution, and you'll learn a lot more about the Green Revolution in part two of this lecture, which you'll get tomorrow. But part one deals with human dietary needs. We're going to talk a lot about agriculture and farming and growing food and raising food like cattle and chickens and things like that in this particular unit. We've already talked about fish a little bit, but I think it's kind of important today to kind of essentially understand what it is that we have to grow or that we have to raise in order to feed not just ourselves, but 7.5 billion people on this planet, or I should say 7.8 billion people on this planet. Every year that number changes. I have to get used to that. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit today about this. Just the human diet. The number one thing that makes up, I suppose, the biggest part of the human diet is grains. Now, there are a lot of plants that we can eat. In fact, there's over 50,000 edible plant species in the world. Like tomatoes, for example, that is one edible plant species, right? Watermelon, I mean, that's an edible plant species. But there are three in particular that make up a huge proportion of the human diet, and that's rice, wheat, and corn. It says here 60% of all the caloric intake, all the calories that we consume comes from those three things. So when it comes to agriculture, since there's such a demand for these three things, this is what we grow. I'm not saying that we don't grow tomatoes and watermelons and strawberries, but corn, rice, and wheat, since it makes up such a huge part of our diet, that's going to make up a huge part of our agricultural practices, if that makes any sense. This is a graph that I want you to kind of be familiar with. It's pretty simple. On the y-axis here, it just says total grain production in millions of metric tons. And it kind of gives us a time frame from 1950 all the way up to the late 2000s here, 2020-ish or so. But you'll just kind of notice the trend, right? It just kind of seems to be sort of steadily increasing through time. The last 60, 70 years, obviously we've had to grow, more grain, grow more rice, wheat, and corn. That's mainly because we have more people. Now, one thing I want you to kind of be a little bit aware of is the shape of this line. It's for the most part, kind of a straight line. It's kind of a linear graph. I know there's some ups and downs in a little bit, but for the most part, it's kind of a linear, kind of a steady increase. But that's not really how the world's population is increasing, right? You might remember back from our population unit, right? I mean, the world's population is growing, with that J curve, right? That exponential growth. So we're not producing an exponential amount of grain. We're just kind of steadily increasing it each year, but the world's population isn't necessarily growing like that. So, there's kind of I'm not going to say a fear, but there is some growing concern that, we're not going to be able to produce enough grain to keep up with the world's population, okay, or at least how the world's population is growing. Here's a really good example of this. This graph It says here number of days of grain consumption. And then we have years at the bottom. What this is basically telling us is that, let's say back in 19, let's say 60, okay? If in 1960 the world just stopped producing grain, we would have about, according to this graph, about 90 days worth of surplus, like grain that's already here, in order to feed the world. So the world would have about 90 days worth of grain. That was back in 1960. Now take a look at today, around 2020. Again, if the world stopped producing grain, all right, we have about 65 days worth of reserves on this planet. So that means the world's population can only be sustained with grain for about 65 years, or I should say about 65 days. So that's lower than a lot of previous years. And again, part of that is, well, in fact, the big reason why is because, again, the world's population is growing like this, whereas our grain production is just kind of growing steadily. So that's some concern. We have to find ways to be innovative. We have to find ways to either one, produce more food, or B, produce less people. And the producing less people part has become kind of a challenge because it's not really working, whatever we're doing. All right, now the second major component to the human diet is meat. Meat technically can be defined as livestock. These are things that we can raise on land. Beef, veal, pork, lamb, even poultry falls into this. Fish does not fall into this category, even though a lot of people kind of debate, because we have so many aquaculture farms that are basically growing fish on a farm, that we should kind of include them into this category. But meat and fish we kind of separate out into two different categories. Anyway, one thing about meat, which is kind of interesting, is meat for the most part is an expensive commodity. I mean, if you want to go out and buy some pork chops, or buy a nice T-bone steak or a porterhouse or something, it's going to cost you some money. I mean, next time you're at the grocery store with your parents, or you're in there by yourself or something, go to the meat aisle and look and see how much a nice big juicy steak costs. They're not cheap. It's probably going to cost you maybe $12, $15 to buy yourself a pretty nice cut of beef or cut of steak. Now, what's interesting about the economics of meat is, as people's income increases, they tend to add more meat to their diet. So, for example, somebody who's like poor, or they, let's say they don't have a very big income, they're probably less likely to go to a grocery store and buy a $12 or $15 cut of steak, right? But the more money you have, the more meat they're going to add to their diet. That's just kind of the economics of it. But I want to go back to demographic transition. We've got whole countries of people that are moving from these different stages of demographic transition. You might remember the four stages, right? Stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. Stage 1, there's really not very many countries that are in stage 1, if any. But stage 2, those are kind of a lot of your, developing countries. And a lot of people that live in those countries, unless they're raising, the animals themselves, they're probably not very big meat eaters because of the cost of the meat. But as those countries move into stage 3, and we're getting a lot of countries that are starting to do that, then we're talking millions, in some cases billions of people that are becoming more meat eaters. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Is meat's expensive, but again, as we make more money, as countries move along that demographic transition, they actually become more meat eaters and they consume more. And that's evident by this graph here. This is per capita meat consumption, so that's per person. This is in kilograms. A kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So in 1960, let's just take a look at the United States. In 1960, the average person per year consumed about 60 kilograms of meat per person. That's about 130 pounds of meat. So imagine 130 pounds of meat per person. Okay. Now, today, we're over here, we're consuming maybe about 75 or so kilograms. That's maybe about 160 or so pounds of meat every single year. So we've gone from 60 kilograms in 1960 to about 75 kilograms today. So we've gone up, okay, in the US. We're consuming more meat now than we did back in 1960. Now, you will notice here this little dip kind of at the end, kind of sort of in the 2000s, has kind of gone down a little bit here. This is mainly due to like diet fads, like, I don't know, people are just consuming less meat because of, I don't know, certain diet trends and things like that in our country. So that they tend to have consumed less, but there's a few more factors that come into play with that as well. But it's kind of an interesting drop there. Now, globally, if you look at the purple line here, this is kind of interesting. So back in 1960, the average global citizen, not just the United States, was consuming about 20 kilograms of meat per person. That's roughly about 50 pounds. But today, they're consuming over 40 kilograms. So think about this, 20 to 40-ish or higher. They've more than doubled their meat consumption. That hasn't happened in the US. We haven't more than doubled our meat consumption in the last 50 or 60 years. But globally, that has happened. So, what that tells us is other countries around the world are becoming more meat eaters or more meat consumers than we are here in the US. I mean, yeah, we're consuming more meat as a country, but as far as per capita, it's actually gone up more around the world than it has more in the United States in the last 50 or 60 years. So, again, a lot of that has to do with demographic transition. Countries are moving into those stages 2 and 3. All right, just a few statistics here I want to throw at you. 800 million people lack access to adequate amounts of food. So that's a lot of people around the world that just don't have, access to the food that they need. 24,000 people starve to death every single day in the world. So that's kind of an alarming statistic. An average adult needs about 2,200 kilocalories. That's a food calorie every single day. It kind of varies from person to person, but that's kind of an average. And even like males and females, it differs a little bit. But again, 2,200 is what we need. So here's a term here. It's called undernourished. Undernourished basically means you are not consuming enough calories to consider to be healthy. In the United States, I wouldn't say that a lot of people are undernourished. Some people are. I would think, we kind of look at ourselves as being a country that, for the most part, we get access to the food that we need depending on where we live. But the term undernourished, there are people on this planet that just flat out don't get enough calories. And if you don't get enough calories, you don't have enough energy. If you don't have enough energy, it's really difficult for you to perform daily activities. So you're very lethargic. You don't have, again, kind of the gusto or the energy that you need just to get through your daily routines. In children, this is very concerning because lack of nourishment, undernutrition, can lead to improper brain development and low IQ. Your body needs energy, your brain needs energy. So it's very important that you eat, especially when you're young, especially when you're an infant. If tiny kids, like little tiny babies, don't get nourishment, then they have severe brain development issues. And that's a major, major problem. All right. Um, Over 3 billion people in the world. Now remember, there's 7.8 billion people on this planet. So this is kind of getting close to roughly half, close, are what we call malnourished. Now, malnourished is a little bit different from undernourished. Undernourished means you don't get the calories that you need. You're just not getting enough food. But people who are malnourished, they get the calories that they need. They're just not getting the other things that they need from food. Things like protein and vitamins and minerals and things like this. There's one particular malnourishment or condition because of malnourishment. It's called anemia. Anemia is caused by an iron deficiency. It basically means that you're not getting enough iron in your diet. It is the most widespread nutritional deficiency in the world. 3 billion people on this planet suffer from anemia, and it's mainly found in developing countries. We don't see a lot of anemia in the United States, and you'll probably understand why in a second. But again, it's caused by, again, a lack of iron. It can also be caused by things like HIV or AIDS. The parasite malaria can cause anemia. Some parasitic infections can cause it as well, but far and away, most of it is caused by malnourishment. People are just not eating the right things. Um, Two of these things, green vegetables and red meat. If your diet lacks those things, then your chances of suffering from anemia are greatly enhanced. But again, it could be caused by some other things as well. The continent of Africa. Continent of Africa is like a perfect storm for anemia. AIDS is a very common disease on that continent. Malaria is a common disease on that continent. They have poor sanitation. They have poor, um, they don't have very good sanitation when it comes to water. So they have a lot of parasitic infections. They have difficulty growing a lot of food. There's a lot of poor people there that can't afford red meat. So, I mean, talk about, again, sort of a perfect storm. The whole continent of Africa is problematic. A lot of Southeast Asia, the same thing. We see a lot of these things in those countries as well. All right, other nutritional deficiencies. There's one here. You may have seen this before, like you've ever seen like those like Save the Children infomercials and things like that. This is called kwashiorkor. Kwashiorkor is mainly found in young kids whose diets lack protein, but not necessarily calories. The big symptom of this is that big bloated belly. It's actually caused by a enlarged liver. I believe is the main cause of this. It's all because of a lack of protein in the diet. This one here is called marasmus. Marasmus is again, you've probably seen this before in these like commercials and stuff, or saving the kids and all that. I mean, these are not made up pictures. I mean, these are actual children. In this case, their diet lacks protein and calories. I mean, these aren't dolls. They're not mannequins. These are actual human beings. The result of this is again is stunted growth, thin bodies. I mean, just this very sickly look. These kids, if they don't eat food, they're probably going to die. I hate to say that, but this is a lot of things are wrong with these individuals because they just flat out don't have the food that's required to keep them alive. This is called goiter. Goiter is another condition due to malnourishment. It's when your diet lacks iodine. Iodine is something that, in the United States, for example, we get plenty of it because it's in our salt. We have iodized salt. But other places around the world where they may not have access to iodized salt, which means they'll probably have a lack of iodine in their diet, it causes an enlargement of the thyroid gland, which is what you're kind of seeing in this picture here. Of course, if they were to get iodine in their diet, this condition would most likely go away. But again, it is sort of a serious condition that's due to, again, that lack of iodine. This is a vitamin A deficiency. This is one of the leading causes of blindness in children around the world. Vitamin A is found in foods like a lot of green vegetables, even things like carrots and sweet potatoes. But if people don't have access to those types of foods, they're not going to get their vitamin A, which is needed for proper eye development and also skin. It helps keep your skin healthy. So people that have this, not only are they blind, they usually get a lot of skin rashes and sores on the skin. You can kind of see that on the kid's chin and forehead here. 250,000 children every year become blind due to a lack of vitamin A, and I don't believe it's reversible. I think it's permanent, as far as I know. I'm not positive about that, but vitamin A deficiency. So again, this is lack of proper nutrition. A couple more terms here: food security. The term food security says it's a condition in which people have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs for an active and healthy life. Access refers to economic, social, and physical availability of food. So, like for example, I would say that Crown Point, living in this town, we have food security. We have access to safe food and healthy food. Whether or not people can afford it, that's a different story. But for the most part, I would say that we have food security here. Food insecurity is basically when people don't have access to adequate food for a variety of reasons. It could be because of money. It could be because of, I don't know, this there isn't physically any food available. Again, we have countries around the world that are food insecure. Now, what this can lead to is something called famine. Famine is a condition in which food insecurity is on a much larger scale. And it results in a very high number of deaths, usually over a short period of time. It's just basically mass starvation. Famines can a lot of times are the results of just failures of crops to grow. We see this a lot in countries where, let's say that there's a drought. Again, I'll use Africa as an example. In Africa, they have like wet seasons and dry seasons. The wet season is literally like 3 or 4 months, just like continuous rain. But some years they don't get those wet seasons. Like if there's an El Nino or a La Nina year or something, sometimes the wet season never comes. So if that happens, they don't get any rain for like a year. I mean, literally like no rain. So talk about crop failure, like on a massive scale. We're talking like an entire continent of people doesn't get the food that they need because they can't grow their crops. So that would lead to like massive famine and massive starvation. This is extremely, I'm not gonna say common, but if it, when it does happen, it usually happens in developing countries or poor countries that just don't have any access to other types of food or any storages of food. Here's a term here called a food desert. There's a video that I want you to watch today in Buzz, and it's all about food deserts. A food desert is basically a U.S. term. It's a term that we use to describe specific areas in our country that are just devoid of healthy food. Again, in Crown Point, I wouldn't consider Crown Point a food desert. We have access to healthy food if we want to go to the grocery store or a farmer's market or whatever. But you go to, let's say, the south side of Chicago, and this usually happens in big cities where you've got like poor areas of these cities where there may not be access to healthy food for several city blocks or maybe even miles. Imagine living in an area where, let's say 4 or 5 city blocks, there's all there is fast food, gas station food, liquor stores, and that's it. There's no grocery store. If there is, it might be just like a small market. Maybe they don't sell any produce. Maybe they just sell canned foods or bagged foods, things like that. But I mean, imagine not having any access to healthy food. Well, that's what food deserts are, and these are becoming an increasing problem in a lot of urban areas, especially poor, low socioeconomic areas in some of our big cities. So that video you're going to watch today is about 10 minutes long, and it's about food deserts and about how one individual decided to do something about it. So watch that. It's kind of an interesting video. It's a TED Talk. It's really good. Anyway. Another term here, overnutrition. I think we kind of understand what this means, right? This is just the ingestion of too many calories. We've got, for example, in our own country, a pretty big problem with overnutrition. This is mainly an issue in developed countries, where, we have access to probably too much food, and not only that, but just food that isn't really that healthy. Food that's high in high fructose corn syrup, it's high in calories, maybe lacking other nutritional content. The World Health Organization has estimated over 1 billion people in the world are overweight. Most of them are in developed countries, and roughly 300 million people are considered obese, which means 20% above what their ideal weight is supposed to be. So again, overnutrition, mainly an issue in the developed world. So I think that's kind of an interesting contrast between the dietary issues of the developed countries versus the developing countries. All right, last couple of things here, real quick. Reasons for dietary and accessibility problems. The biggest reason for dietary problems and accessibility problems is poverty. People just have the lack of resources to get food. Poverty is the number one reason for global dietary problems. Food exists; they can't just get access to it for whatever reason. Producing more food is not going to fix the poverty problem. We can make more food and maybe we can distribute it to people, but it's not going to change the fact that these people don't have the money or the resources to purchase a lot of the food on their own. Political and economic factors, one of the big things that can affect dietary problems is war. People have to flee their homes. And when they have to flee their homes, they have to go elsewhere. Maybe they become refugees in other countries, and they can't just get access to proper food. So that's a pretty big issue. And then finally, this is one that we don't really think about too much. We will talk about. It's called feeding livestock. In the United States, I go back to grain. 60% of the human diet comes from grain. But you would think that all the grain that we grow in this country, wheat or corn or whatever it is, you would think that food would go directly to the people. But here's an interesting statistic: 40% of all the grain that's grown in the United States, 40% of it goes to feed livestock. It goes to feed cows and chicken and pigs and whatever. So imagine a corn farm, that's 30 or 40 acres or whatever. 40% of that corn that's being grown is going to be shipped off so some cow can eat it, not for people. All right, so kind of an interesting statistic there. That results in less energy that goes into the human diet, instead it's going into these cows. Now, indirectly, we might be eating these cows, but I don't know. I think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about where all that grain actually goes. All right, finally, to kind of sum this up today, I want us to think about three things as we go through these next couple of lectures. Number one, can we produce enough food to feed the population? Okay, that's an important thing, all right? And it's kind of a question that kind of leads us to where our current state is of agriculture. We have to grow a lot of food because we have a lot of people. Number two, can we make sure everyone has access to healthy food? like green vegetables and things like that? Do they have access to it? I mean, we can grow it, but does that mean it's going to get to the people? Can we produce food without harming the environment? You're going to see again the next couple of days a lot of the things that we do agriculturally are very damaging to our planet. We have to grow food, but we have to grow it in a way that's not going to destroy the earth. So these are three things that I really want us to focus on as we move forward. All right, guys, that's it for me for today. Take care. I'll see you soon.